Hi there, I'm Will Lowen, and thanks for tuning in to the sermon videos here at Trinity Mennonite Church in Calgary, Alberta. For the months of May and June, I'll be doing a sermon series called Government and God's People, a look at how the church today, the early church, even the people of Israel in the Old Testament, how they did and how they should interact with the government forces around them. It will involve looking at some controversial issues of our day, and I know that a lot of us bring a high level of personal and emotional involvement into these subjects, and so take that into consideration as you're watching this. This isn't a lecture series on policing or public policy or immunology or any of that. These are sermons I'm hoping to inform and inspire by looking at God's Word and how we, the church, are supposed to behave. I hope this series is helpful and inspiring for you.
This morning I'm going to be reading from Acts 16, verses 27 to 40. When the jailer woke up and saw that the doors were open, he thought that the prisoners had escaped. He pulled out his sword and was about to kill himself, but Paul shouted, "Don't harm yourself, no one has escaped." The jailer asked for a torch and went into the jail. He was shaking all over as he knelt down in front of Paul and Silas. After he had led them out of the jail, he asked, "What must I do to be saved?" They replied, "Have faith in the Lord Jesus and you will be saved. This is also true for everyone who lives in your home." Then Paul and Silas told him and everyone else in his house about the Lord. While it was still night, the jailer took them to a place where he could wash their cuts and bruises. Then he and everyone in his home were baptized. They were very glad that they had put their faith in God. After this, the jailer took Paul and Silas to his home and gave them something to eat. The next morning, the officials sent some police with orders for the jailer to let Paul and Silas go. The jailer told Paul, "The officials have ordered me to set you free. Now you can leave in peace." But Paul told the police, "We are Roman citizens, and the Roman officials had us beaten in public without giving us a trial. They threw us into jail. Now do you think they can secretly send us away? No, they cannot. They will have to come here themselves and let us out." When the police told the officials that Paul and Silas were Roman citizens, the officials were afraid, so they came and apologized. They led them out of the jail and asked them to please leave town. But Paul and Silas went straight to the home of Lydia, where they saw the Lord's followers and encouraged them. Then they left.
Thank you, Jenna, for that reading. So I drew up this schedule of talking about some of the spiritual topics that came up in response to the ongoing conversation around the church and the lockdown, or as I've called the series, Government and God's People. The topic of freedom was something that was necessary to include, and I thought it would be good to set aside one Sunday for that. And as I poured over these stories and examples this week, I thought, boy, I could have given 2 or 3 Sundays for this topic. When I was in university, which this will give away how old I am, but there are other plainly visible evidences of how old I am. We watched the movie Braveheart a lot. It came out in 1995. I was in university starting in 1997. And somebody had gotten a copy of the video on VHS, which also says how old it was. But this was sort of what we did a bunch of times. We would watch Braveheart. I think I watched it a dozen times within my first 2 years in university. And we watched it even though I had no real affinity with the Scottish history around the story. I had no real affinity with any of the characters. I hadn't studied that history. It wasn't part of my biological story as well. But the story of freedom resonates with us as human beings. We crave freedom, especially as young people. We want freedom to make our own decisions, and so that was a time in my life where me and my contemporaries were focusing on freedom. We also crave freedom when we feel oppression from outside. I've heard a few times from various people in other parts of the world who talk about their love of American movies, but not just in general, not just because the production quality is better or the humor is better. They like the American insistence on telling freedom stories. Americans love telling stories about freedom. Braveheart is a Scottish story, but told through American movie lenses. And the twists that they had to do in the storyline to fit it into an American movie are evident, and we could debate that at length as well. But people from other parts of the world, especially poor and oppressed parts of the world, they love these freedom stories, but they're confused why Americans love freedom stories. Because in freedom stories, the small and oppressed minority rises up to take power away from the oppressor. In many parts of the world, the United States is viewed as the oppressor, the empire, the dictators in other parts of the world that the weak are seeking to rise up against. They love freedom movies, but they are confused as to why Americans do. We all love freedom, and so I thought it would be good to include some quotes on freedom. The first one comes from the movie that I was just discussing. If you've seen the movie, you will remember the scene very well. Mel Gibson, who plays William Wallace, is riding along on his horse, and he's yelling to encourage the soldiers fighting with him. And he's talking about the English, the dirty scoundrels who have taken away their land. He says, "They can take our land, but they will never take our freedom." And I was tempted to write freedom in all caps, just to somehow encapsulate the passion of that quote. This is something that you will hear, maybe not in these exact words, but in the writings of people from all parts of the world in various times in history. But I thought in sort of our North American context, I might cite some more local politicians. And this is one from a figure many of you will recognize, Ronald Reagan. He writes that freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We didn't pass it to our children in the bloodstream. It must be fought for, protected, and handed on for them to do the same. Ronald Reagan is a hero of the political right in the United States, and a similar sentiment comes from another figure who is in many ways a hero to the political left. This comes from John F. Kennedy, and I won't try the New England accent he's famous for. He says, "The cost of freedom is always high, but Americans have always paid it. And one path we shall never choose, and that is the path of surrender or submission." Both of those inspire in us a sense of patriotism. Even if we're not American, we feel that about our own sense of freedom in this country and the processes by which our freedom is earned and protected. It's interesting how throughout this lockdown and other conversations around freedom, we see a convergence of the extreme left and the extreme right. The extreme right on the conservative side, the sort of the libertarian wing of the Conservative Party, they are focused on freedom. Freedom from big oppressive government policies, and they emphasize freedom because it's so important to them that the individual has the freedom to make their own choices without the interference of the government. But on the other side, the liberal side, the liberating side, They want to get all of the forces of human society and government away from interfering on the individual rights of the person so that they can be liberated. So in these freedom rallies, you see both extreme left and extreme right represented, because freedom is a popular topic of conversation for both sides. So I thought I'd find a Canadian voice on this, and so I found a quote from former Prime Minister John Diefenbaker, and he says this: "I am a Canadian, free to speak without fear, free to worship in my own way, free to stand for what I think right, free to oppose what I believe wrong, or free to choose those who shall govern my country. This heritage of freedom I pledge to uphold for myself and all mankind." So freedom is central to our identity as Canadians as well. In fact, the Mennonite story coming to Canada from other parts of the world, my ancestors came to Canada because the Queen promised freedom to all who would come to live in the newly acquired land. My ancestors came to this land because they had freedom of worship, freedom of education, freedom of language, freedom of military exemption. All of those freedoms were important to my family history, important to our theological identity. And then my ancestors felt that those promises had been rescinded, and so they went to Mexico instead, where they could live out that freedom in different ways. Another quote from John Diefenbaker that I thought might inspire a chuckle from some of you. This may sort of seem contradictory to what he said earlier, but he says, in Pierre Trudeau, Canada has finally produced a prime minister worthy of assassination. Always a flair for the dramatic, these politicians, even in Canada. Which I think connects really well to the next quote that I found from Abraham Lincoln, which says, "Those who deny freedom to others deserve it not for themselves." There's an irony to freedom. Our understandings of freedom often require other people's freedom to be restricted so that ours can be lived out. For me to have the freedom to do what I want to do, we have to restrict the freedom of the people who don't like me and don't like people like me. Christian freedom is a big topic these days, and when pastors are arrested, when church doors are locked shut by policemen, the conversation doesn't just happen in the media, it happens in chat rooms, it happens in living rooms and on balconies. Christian liberty is a big concept, and it is one that I think will continue long after the pandemic is over. So if we're going to be talking about freedom within a Christian context, we have to see what the Bible says about freedom. In the Old Testament, we see a lot of references to freedom because the people of Israel were at one point the oppressed slave population of Egypt. And so for the rest of their identity, God reminds, through the prophets and the priests, reminds them that they were once slaves in Egypt and that they have now been made free. Free to live their lives, free to return to the promised land, free to live out their own religion and culture and family life as they wanted. But we see in the Old Testament, from time to time, the people of Israel forget that legacy and inflict suffering and enslavement and persecution on the alien in their midst or on the nations around them. The struggle for identifying as free people never ends, because if you're going to identify as someone who is free, you can't then at the same time inflict oppression on other people. Another Old Testament story I wanted to look at is the story of how Rehoboam took over from King Solomon. Rehoboam was going to be the next king. He had inherited a wealthy country, a united country, a powerful legacy from his father and grandfather. But as soon as he took office, a delegation from the north part of the country came and said to him, "Listen, king, we have been carrying a heavier burden under your father than those in the south end of our kingdom. And so going forward, we would like to operate with fewer restrictions, lesser burdens than your father gave us." And so the king took this into advisement, and he went to talk to his advisors, some of whom had also advised his father. And the older advisors said, "They are right. We have inflicted greater punishment. We've asked them to carry a heavier burden than the rest, and so we should grant them greater freedom." The younger advisors, who were friends with Rehoboam, said, "No, forget those guys. You're the king. You can do whatever you want. You give in to their request for freedom, then pretty soon everybody is going to be coming to ask for freedom, and you'll never have any power. So you need to come down hard on them and make it harder for them than it was under your father." So that's what Rehoboam did, and as a result, the kingdom was divided. They had come to ask for freedom, and when it wasn't granted, they took it. And so the kingdom was divided, and the story of Israel was forever changed. I did a search for stories and quotes of freedom in the New Testament. The story of Paul and Silas I thought was especially telling of that, as Michelle's children's story today played out very well. Paul and Silas have been arrested. It wasn't the first time, it wouldn't be the last time. They were arrested for causing trouble. They were arrested for interfering with the ways that society worked under a Roman system. And so in this case, they're arrested for interfering with the economy. We'll get into the economy on another Sunday. And so they find themselves in prison, and what happens, there's a prison break. They are allowed to escape. They are allowed to experience freedom. But what happens, they stay. They choose to stay, partly because they know that the jailer has been tasked with keeping them there. And the jailer knows if those guys are all gone, he will be punished with his life. And so he's prepared to kind of preempt that punishment. And the people, Paul and Silas, interject, they interrupt the suicide that the jailer has planned. Why? Because they want to free him as well. See, whenever we have this conversation about freedom, we have to ask two questions. What are we as Christians free from? And what are we free to do, free to be, free to experience? So Paul and Silas, they were in prison, but they had experienced freedom from sin, free from the spiritual consequences of living for themselves. And even though they were now free from physical confinement in the jail, they didn't want the jailer to still live in bondage of his sinful life. They didn't want him to experience the bondage of the sinful world around him. So they had a conversation. They freed him both from the spiritual choices that he was living in, but also from the sin, the oppressive sin that he as a jailer had been participating in. I wanted to tell another story. There's another story from the Martyr's Mirror, but first I want to have a few quotes from the New Testament, other parts of Paul's writings. One part in Galatians chapter 5, verse 1. This is the first quote I wanted to show. When we look at freedom from a Christian perspective, we will see different examples. We will see examples where we are challenged to give up our freedom, and we will see examples where we are challenged to give freedom to other people. So in Galatians chapter 5, verse 1, Paul says, "Christ has set us free for freedom," right? Freedom for freedom's sake. Therefore, sorry, Rick, can you put there we go. Therefore, stand firm and don't submit to the bondage of slavery again. And this resonates with their identity as Jews, that even though they had been released to experience freedom, they often chose to go back into a world of oppression. Another quote from Romans chapter 6, verse 15, gives the other side of it. Romans chapter 6, verse 15 paints a bigger picture, a different picture of the freedom conversation. So he says, so what? Should we sin because we aren't under law but under grace? Absolutely not, right? He's responding to that voice within us that says, yeah, we have freedom. We live in grace. We're not living under rules and oppressiveness. We're free to do what we want. Paul says, absolutely not. We don't have that freedom. We still have restrictions to behave a certain way. The final quote from Paul's writings I wanted to show is from 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 12. There's a whole lot written in the New Testament about freedom, but Paul writes a lot more than what Jesus says. Jesus says very little about freedom. But here we have the last one that I wanted to show you. I have the freedom to do anything, but not everything is helpful. I have the freedom to do anything, but I won't be controlled by anything. So the quotes that I was showing you before from the politicians also sort of painted this picture of freedom as though it's something that we have to work hard to defend. It's something that we have to keep fighting for, keep advocating for, which in a lot of ways doesn't feel like freedom. It feels like a different kind of oppression. I wanted to also tell the story of Dirk Willems this morning. And it plays along similar themes of the Paul and Silas story. I've told the Dirk Willems story many times, and I think it bears repeating. Dirk Willems begins the story in jail. And the Dirk Willems story is famous and well known. He begins the story in jail as a prisoner for his faith. This is the Martyr's Mirror version of the story. And there's a long-winded explanation of how he held on to the faith despite the pressure from the state around him, the Catholic Church around him. But he was imprisoned for his faith, but something happened as he's being transported from one prison to another. He's in a prison cart pulled by horses along a bumpy road, and somehow over one of the bumps, the door to the back of that cart bumps free. And Dirk Willems sees this opportunity, and he discerns that this is a gift from God, and so he runs. He wants to go. He wants to see his family again. He wants to experience freedom. And so he runs from the cart. But one of the policemen, one of the thief catchers, is what the Martyr's Mirror story says, leading the cart, they see that he's escaped and so begin to chase him through the woods. And this was a time of the year where there was ice over the river, and so as Dirk is running, he sees the ice, and he's going to run across the river to freedom. And Dirk has been in prison. He's been living on a prison diet, and so he's thin, and as he runs across the ice, he gets there no problem. But the thief catcher has had a more generous diet lately, and he's a heavier man, and he falls through the ice. So in this particular moment, Dirk could celebrate the discovery of freedom. He could continue to run and go back to his family, reunite with his church community, and celebrate the gift of freedom that God had given him. But he can't do it. Much like Paul and Silas couldn't run away in freedom and leave the jailer to the consequences, the man had fallen through the ice and was calling for help. There was nobody to help him but Dirk. So Dirk ran back rescued the thief catcher, pulled him out of the frigid water, built a fire to warm him up. And so what happened? Well, the thief catcher realized he had been spared. He had been freed from the consequences of his actions and advocated for Dirk's freedom, but the thief catcher's bosses, the magistrates in charge, reminded them of their oath, reminded them of what they had promised to do. And so Dirk was again arrested and was killed. The story of Dirk Willems is a challenge to our sense of individual freedom. We don't get to live out our own impulses the way that whatever we're inspired to do on our own. We experience freedom in a spiritual sense, free from the consequences of our sinful choices. But at the same time, we are not free to do whatever we want, because we recognize that in many ways that we as human beings will often be given a selfish impulse. And so to be freed from that is also to be freed of the consequences of following that selfish impulse. Dirk Willems is a hero, not just because he died for his faith, not just because he was innocent, but because despite the freedom he had been given, he went back and demonstrated true love, true heroism, and saved that man's life. Who is free in that story? Dirk was free. Dirk was free to make the choice that he wanted, knowing that there would be consequences either way. And the consequences to running home by himself were spiritual. The consequences to going back and risk being arrested again, those were physical. And so he chose to accept the physical consequences to continue to live in spiritual freedom for the time that he had. We celebrate the freedom that God has given to us. And the way that we celebrate that is to live into the spiritual freedom, which often means accepting the physical consequences of our choices. There are many churches and pastors who've gotten famous for their positions on freedom, and I'll explore those going forward. But my challenge this morning is to follow the examples of Dirk, follow the examples of Paul and Silas, and follow the examples of the people of the Northern Kingdom who understood that freedom was within their grasp. And if they were going to live into that freedom, they had to set aside their fears of the physical consequences. When we accept the consequences of our physical choices, then we get to fully experience God's freedom. When I did a search for mentions of freedom and liberation in the Bible, there were lots in the Old Testament, there were lots in Paul's writings. Jesus didn't say much at all. But at the core of his message was that he had come to liberate the oppressed. We are the oppressed, but we also get to participate in the liberation of the oppression from others, the oppression for others. So today, as we reflect on our freedom, may we also reflect on the freedom of others and be challenged and empowered to love and show hope and compassion to those who are oppressed in our world and those who would oppress us. Amen.